All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Classic Comics live stream, another Trek Talk, where I take a look at one of the episodes of the original Star Trek series. This week, it's going to be one of my personal favorites. I think it's probably a favorite for a lot of fans, really, and that is the Gamesters of Triskelion. And hail at FKHC 2005. Good to see you, sir. And also hail to Gwagnar. Thanks for stopping in again, sir. Always good to see you. All right. So, yeah, this is definitely a fun one. And it's one of the ones in my mind just really kind of epitomizes Star Trek, or at least the original series, with its mix of action and, kind of sci fi concepts. This is an episode that I think really shows the influence that the John Carter Barsoom novels have on the original Star Trek series, because this whole idea of basically kind of gladiatorial matches on another planet, that was really, as I think, as far as I know, like it was the John Carter novels that did that first. And also, you notice that the thralls, they all wear these kind of harnesses, and that is another thing that I'm pretty sure was borrowed from the Barsoom novels, because the Martians, they a lot of them wear that type of stuff. And FKAC Gwagnar UFOs on Sunday. Yeah, aren't you having another uh, movie marathon, Gwagnar? If you are, I'd be interested in showing up. Okay, so this episode, well, let me grab this. Okay, so this is from an NBC press release issued December 12th, 1967. Captain Kirk, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekov vanish during the transport process and find themselves prisoners of highly developed masses of brains without bodies and Gamesters of Triskelion on NBC. Yes, you have no. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I might be able to make that. Probably going to be my schedule is going to be pretty open. I think it looks like. Where was I? Okay, yeah. So Joseph Ruskin and Angelique Pettyjohn guest star. The three are forced down on a planet of slaves called thralls, who exist solely for the benefit of the brain masses called providers, whose only diversion is to watch and gamble on combat to the death among humans. Galt, the master thrall, assigns drill thralls to train the three officers for combat. Shauna is assigned to Kirk and falls in love with him. Shocker! Who would have seen that coming? Kirk then challenges the providers to a daring wager. Oh, so what do we got? So invasion, UFO, when worlds collide, and crawl. Ah, interesting. Okay, so Spock left in command of the Enterprise and believing that the landing party was caught in a long-range transporter beam from an unexplored section of space, takes a calculated risk when he decides to send the ship halfway across the galaxy on a rescue mission. The theme focuses on man's nature to resist any form of confinement. Even the providers are prisoners of their own questionable evolution, demonstrating that too much time and too little mobility does what too much time and too little mobility does to one's spirit and morality. Couch potatoes, take notes. The Gamesters of Triskelion is an imaginative and iconic science fiction tale. It's fast paced and entertaining. It is justifiably popular among fans of the series. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I am reading from These Are the Voyages by Mark Cushman, as always, for this behind the scenes information. Entertainment Weekly, which ranked Gamesters as the 14th best episode of the original Star Trek, said, quote, "It's American gladiators in space. Three brain creatures living in what looks like a big dairy case force Kirk to battle assorted opponents armed only with an enormous can opener. There's a certain degree of campiness, of course. The disembodied brains under glass and Kirk's drill thrall dressed in an aluminum foil go-go dancer outfit certainly register on the camp meter. And we've seen some of these story beats before. McCoy challenging Spock's decisions the moment the latter assumes command, such as in Galileo 7. And there have been other ones. I can't think of them right off, but there's been at least a couple of others. There was one like that just a couple episodes back. Kirk being punished with pain, such as in Charlie X, and of course we see the agonizers in Mirror Mirror. An alien attack sending Kirk and the others into a choking fit. Metamorphosis, and the bridge crew invited to watch the televised event of Kirk battling for his life, such as in Arena. Also, the theme, as well as the plot point of human captives, kept to amuse an advanced but morally depraved race, was explored all the way back in The Cage. Recycled or not, most of it works, and the story ends with a stirring message of freedom. All right. So we'll get into this episode here. So the Enterprise is orbiting Gamma 2, an uninhabited planet with an automated communications and astrogation facility. Kirk and Chekov and Uhura plan to beam down to inspect the station, but before they can be transported, they vanish from the transporter pad. Scotty informs Spock, who says they'll scan Gamma 2 to find them. Now, Kirk and the others appear on a planet's surface, and at first they assume it must be Gamma 2, but the planet is a trinary star system, which means they can't be on Gamma 2. Kirk tries to contact the Enterprise, but their communicators aren't working. Then they notice several aliens armed with various hand weapons approaching them. See them here. Kirk orders the use of phasers, but the phasers aren't working either. So a melee ensues as the aliens attack the landing party. Chekov and Uhura are quickly captured, but Kirk gets the best of his opponent until one of the female aliens hits him from behind and then manages to subdue him. And this is written by Margaret Arman. And I think I think I must not have included, but it's directed by Gene Nelson. Gene Nelson. All right, now another alien appears from nowhere who introduces himself as Galt and says he is the master thrall of the planet Triskelion. Kirk asks how they came to be on the planet and how Galt knows their names. Galt tells him that the providers arranged for the landing party to appear here, and their old lives are now over. From now on, they will serve the providers after they have undergone the proper training. Now, back on the Enterprise, Scotty says that he's examined the transporter and there's no indication of a malfunction. Spock says that scans of Gamma 2 also indicate there are no signs of life. McCoy demands to know what Spock intends to do about the situation. I'd say every time this happens, when Kirk is gone and Spock is left in command, it's like McCoy immediately just starts badgering him. You know, like, do something, Spock. What are you going to do, Spock? You know, I mean, dude, let him do his job. Let's see. And Spock responds that at present, all they can do is continue scanning in hopes of finding them and hope for the best. Now, McCoy muses that hope is a human failing, and Spock agrees, admitting that prolonged exposure to humans can inevitably lead to a certain amount of contamination. Now, the landing party are taken to their prison cells, and I love how they already have their little nameplates on them. I don't know why, but that amuses me. So Kirk and the others, they try to escape, but as they make a run for it, oh, and I forgot to mention did I show them? Did they have the collars earlier? Yeah, so they've had these collars put around their necks. I should have mentioned that earlier. That are just the same as the ones all the other thralls are wearing. So as they try to run, Galt's eyes glow, and in this image, which you've probably seen in a lot of thumbnails and memes, the collars begin to glow, and they all start to choke or feel pain. Very reminiscent of the agonizer from the Mirror Mirror episode. Galt tells Kirk that escape is impossible, and they reluctantly go into their cells. Now, Spock informs McCoy that they have scanned the entire solar system and can find no trace of them. McCoy demands that Spock keep looking, but Spock notes that they have no idea where else to look. Kirk and the others discuss their predicament, with Kirk noting they're in a completely different star system, so they must be a long way from the Enterprise, although they're sure Spock is probably looking for them. And I love these pink prison bars they have. It looks like they're in Barbie's Malibu Penitentiary or something. So one of the thralls, a tall man, comes to Uhura's cell. He introduces himself as Lars, and he tells Uhura that he has been selected for her. He enters her cell, and then we hear Uhura screaming and sounds of a struggle as Kirk demands to know what is happening to her. Now, eventually, Lars leaves the cell, angrily noting that it is not allowed to resist selection. And I can tell you from personal experience, this line never works. It's never worked for me. Okay, on the Enterprise, Spock records a log noting that the landing party has been missing for 2 hours. As lieutenant at the, oh no, not lieutenant, an ensign. There's an ensign at the science station. He tells them that she's getting odd readings from a nearby hydrogen cloud. Spock notes that the cloud has higher than expected energy readings, and there is an ion trail that seems to extend from the cloud leading out to the gamma system, or out of the gamma system. With no other options, Spock orders the helm to plot a course to follow the ion trail, which McCoy is not happy about. Now, back on Triskelion, one of the female thralls brings Kirk a meal. Whereas I guess I got these out of sequence. And orders him to eat while the other brings a meal for Chekov. Now, this one, who has this kind of yellowish skin, introduces herself as Tamoon, and she is clearly interested in Chekov, or Chikov, as she calls him. And Chekov is more than a little uncomfortable with the whole thing. Meanwhile, Kirk is having a chat with his trainer, Shauna, who tells him that they have been trained. When they have been trained, they will be vended or sold to the provider that offers the most quatlus for them. So he asks how the collars work, and she refuses to talk about it. So Kirk starts turning on the charm, noting that she's a beautiful woman. But she doesn't know what that word means. So Kirk shows her her reflection, telling her that that's what beauty is. Now he asks where she was born, and she says that she has always been here on Triskelion. When he asks about her parents, she says that her mother was killed in a freestyle match. I'm guessing they don't mean like rapping. And before she can ask, or he can ask anything more, a chime goes off, and she tells Kirk that it is time to begin training. Back on the Enterprise, McCoy is frustrated that Spock has chosen to leave the Gamma system since they seem to be heading out into empty space. Spock notes that the nearest system on this heading is the M24 Alpha system, which is over 11.630 light years away. McCoy asks Spock if he seriously thinks the landing party could have been beamed away from that distance, saying that Spock must be out of his Vulcan mind. Now on Triskelion, the landing party is undergoing combat training when Galt brings out another thrall. He says that this thrall was slow in obeying commands and that he will be used as a practice target. He orders Uhura to attack him, but she refuses. And Kirk tells Galt that none of them are going to do that, so he zaps them with the collars again. Then he orders that Uhura take his place as a target. Kirk demands to see the providers, saying that he is responsible for his crewmen, so Galt decides that he can be the target instead. I'd like to see the manager. So Kirk's hands are bound, and then he is whipped by one of the thralls until Galt calls for a rest period. Shauna gives him something that looks like grape juice. And then she tells Kirk that Klug, the big alien, has a weak left eye and that she should attack him from that side. The fight resumes, but Kirk is able to get his hands free, and then he jumps on Klug's back and strangles Klug with his bonds. After Klug collapses, a disembodied voice tells them to halt their fight and then declares that it will bid 300 quatlus for the newcomers. Other voices join in as they begin bidding against one another to purchase Kirk, Chekov, and Uhura. Eventually, the first voice bids 2,000 quatlus and wins the bidding. Kirk insists that they're free people and they belong to no one. Then the providers start bidding on whether Kirk and the others can be successfully trained. I'm guessing they spend a lot of time on DraftKings. Their collars turn from white to red, indicating that they're now owned by a provider. And Galt congratulates them, but warns them that further disobedience is punishable by death. All right. Now, later, Shauna and Kirk are running in the countryside nearby, and they stop to rest. Kirk asks her why the providers like to watch others kill each other, and she shrugs, saying this is simply the way it is. He notes that the providers' voices sound mechanical, and he asks if they are computers of some sort, but she doesn't know what that word means. He asks if they have bodies, and she says not like the way she and Kirk have. Then he asks about the ruins around them, but she doesn't know anything about them either. So he asks if it could have been a city for the providers at one time, but this line of discussion makes her uncomfortable, and she refuses to talk about it any further. Kirk then begins talking about Earth and asks if she's ever looked up at the stars and wondered what's out there in the universe. She says that she has noticed them, but nothing more than that. Kirk then observes that the thralls have no freedom and they can only do what the providers command. To which Shauna asks, well, what else would we do? Kirk then talks about love and how on Earth it's the most important thing between a man and a woman. Shauna says that in time they will have mates selected for them, but Kirk tells her that on Earth they select their own mates. Now, all this riz that Kirk is throwing around is making Shauna nervous, and she refuses to discuss this any further, so Kirk turns the discussion back to the providers, asking what they look like and where they are. Shauna says she's never seen them, and before she can say any further, her collar is activated. And she begins writhing in pain, and Kirk pleads with the providers to stop punishing her. One of the providers' voices then notes that Kirk's compassion is interesting, but it has no relevance on Triskelion before deactivating Shauna's collar. Shauna asks why he would risk punishment to help her, and Kirk tells her that on Earth it is customary to help one another. Then he kisses her. And she asks if this is helping, and he says it can be, so she asks him to help her some more. Then Galt appears, telling Kirk that he amuses the providers so there will be no further punishment, and then orders them to return to their cells. Back on the Enterprise, McCoy and Scotty confront Spock, urging him to return to the Gamma system to continue searching there. Spock agrees that if they don't find anything in the M24 Alpha system, they will return to the Gamma system to search further. In Kirk's cell, Shauna brings him a meal. He then knocks Shauna out. He just clocks her right across the chin and then uses this key device that the thralls carry around to open Chekov and Uhura's cells. Chekov has overcome and subdued his trainer as well. They let Uhura out. Then they try to make an escape. They get out to the courtyard, and then they are confronted by Galt, who zaps them with the collars again. Now, while this is going on, the Enterprise arrives in orbit over the planet, and Spock tells McCoy that sensors detect humanoid life signs. He tells McCoy that he will beam down to the planet to look for the landing party, and McCoy decides to join him, but before they can beam down, the provider seize control of the ship, telling Spock that none of his systems will function.
Now, somehow Kirk and the others can hear Spock and McCoy talking to the providers down on the planet, and he explains the situation to them, noting that the providers are cowards who are afraid to show themselves. The providers say that he is no threat to them while he wears the collar, so Kirk dares them to show themselves. Let me take a drink of water right quick here. Hold on. Yes, Quatloos. Precious, precious Quatloos. Okay. So Kirk then appears underground in a chamber, and in front of him are three objects that look like brains. Kirk quickly realizes these are the providers. They explain that they were once similar to humans, but they evolved beyond the need for bodies, noting that while they are physically inferior, they are mentally superior. Kirk wonders why they don't do anything more worthwhile with their great power, and they say that the games among the thralls are the only thing that they find stimulating. Now, they note that Kirk and the others have proven most stimulating for them, but they are also too troublesome, and so they will be destroyed along with the Enterprise so that no one can find their planet. Kirk accuses them of being murderers without the spirit to really wager on the lives they take. They ask Kirk to explain, and he tells them that humans are the greatest gamblers in the galaxy and are competitive by nature. He suggests a match between an equal number of thralls and Enterprise crew with weapons of the provider's choosing. The providers immediately begin wagering Quatloos, but Kirk dismisses the idea of Quatloos, suggesting higher stakes. He suggests that if the Enterprise crew wins, they will be allowed to leave unharmed, and all the thralls must be set free, and the providers will educate them so in time they can begin to govern themselves. If Kirk and his crew lose, then they will stay on the planet as thralls for the providers. And I have to say, it's I don't know. If I was a member of the Enterprise, I wouldn't be too thrilled to find out that Kirk basically wagered, because he says like everyone, it's like the whole crew whose lives and freedom he's wagering here. I'd be like you made that bet for all of us. Why would you do that? Okay, now the providers agree on the condition that the combat is Kirk alone against three thralls. Kirk protests that the terms are unfair, but the providers note that the alternative is death, so Kirk reluctantly agrees. They send Kirk back to the arena where he faces off against his three opponents. The providers also allow the Enterprise crew to watch the match, which is very reminiscent of the arena episode. So Kirk is told that he can't leave the yellow portion of the game field, while the others have to stay on the green portion. But really, I mean, they don't really hold to these rules at all. Kirk's stepping all over the green all the time. All right, so the match ensues. Eventually, he impales Klug, the big one, with his spear. And then there's I don't know if I get shot, so I don't know if you can see it down in the corner. This guy down here in the corner is an Andorian, and he throws his spear at Kirk. Kirk ducks it and impales Lars, with that killing him, leaving only the Andorian left. Now Kirk manages to subdue the Andorian, but he's not dead. So they put in a replacement, which is Shauna. And of course, she's not happy with Kirk, saying, "You lied to me," which, well, yeah, he did. So they fight. She manages to get the best of Kirk at one point, but she can't bring herself to deliver the killing blow. So he manages to trip her, bring her down, and then he subdues her, and she surrenders. So the providers admit that Kirk has won, and the thralls are set free. Kirk tells Shauna that he regrets what he did, but it was necessary. She says she understands and asks if he will leave. When he says yes, she asks to go with him, but Kirk's kind of like, no, but I'll text you, okay? So they beam back to the Enterprise, and Shauna says that she will watch the lights in the sky and always remember him. And it ends there. And Joseph Ruskin was Galt in this episode. Angelique Pettyjohn is Shauna. Of course, we got Nichelle Nichols, James Doohan, Walter Koenig, of course. Steve Sandor played Lars. Jane Ross was Tamoon. Victoria George played that female ensign, Jana Haynes. Mickey Morton played Klug, and Dick Crockett was the Andorian. All right. Go here. There we go. All right, and yeah, and by the way, this one definitely an A. I would be tempted to make it an A plus, but I mean there are some there are some plot holes. I mean, there's a lot of you have to do a lot of hand waving and just sort of like going, okay, whatever, as far as how the providers are able to yank them from the Enterprise so far away to the planet. How is Kirk, you know, when the providers are talking to Spock and McCoy, how is it that Kirk and the others on the planet can hear them talking? How does that work? I don't know. There's there's not a whole lot of hard science going on here. And Wagner says, what you would think after a few decades, the fighting would get repetitive and boring and the providers would try something new. Well, yeah, you would think. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That is the logical thing you would think. But then, then there'd be no story. Okay. Writer Margaret Armin was the daughter of a naval officer, and she spent most of her childhood in Manila, Panama, Japan, and China, where she learned to speak Mandarin. She majored in English literature at the University of California at Berkeley and then furthered her education at UCLA, receiving a bachelor's degree in creative writing. She married in 1945 at the age of 22 and started a family. While raising children, Armin also worked from home, writing newspaper articles, having numerous short stories published, and finally breaking into television. Armin began her career in television the same year as Dorothy Fontana and in the same genre, TV westerns. Armin's first script assignment was in 1959 for Zane Grey Theater. She also placed a script with The Tall Men, which I've never heard of before, which is a show where that Fontana worked on. More westerns followed, including The Lawman, National Velvet, The Rifleman, The Big Valley, and others. By age 45, Armin was eager to leave westerns behind for outer space. Star Trek at first wasn't receptive. Armin said, quote, there was a great deal of discrimination against women at that time, and there were only a handful of us making a living at writing for TV. During the first season, Gene Roddenberry didn't employ any women writers except for his secretary, DC Fontana. She wrote a script that was so good that Gene became receptive to women writers. Armin's agent had approached Star Trek numerous times on behalf of his client before finally getting a response in March of 1967. The order for the second season had just come through, so Roddenberry took Armin's pitch while Gene Coon was on vacation. Armin had the storyline of, which was titled Gamesters of Pentathlon, as it was then called, in mind for a long while. It was originally planned as a science fiction short story about a planet where people were used as gaming animals. When Star Trek aired, she rethought the concept, believing it might make a good fit for the series. Quote, Star Trek seemed the perfect vehicle, Armin said. When I went into Gene with it, the idea was very roughly developed since I had never written for Star Trek before, but Gene saw its potential and talked it through with me until it was tailored to the Star Trek format. On April 1st, 1967, Roddenberry wrote a memo to Gene Kuhn. Margaret came in and surprised me with a truly exciting premise. And we've had a second meeting on it, clarified much of her thinking as to Star Trek format. She seems eager and seems to have an affinity for our type of story. Armin said, I was so pleased when I found out that I had so much of a rapport with Gene. He's a real writer's writer. If you come in there with an idea that's a little rough, Gene can see through it with a writer's eye and envision what it will become and whether or not it will work. He's quite marvelous that way. Okay, so Armin turned in her story outline on April 10th. Dorothy Fontana, liking both Armin and her work, wrote to Kuhn with one primary concern regarding utilizing the thralls as breeding stock. So apparently, in the original script, at one point, there's a scene where Shauna and Kirk are supposed to enjoy what's called an interfusion interval. And apparently, this was just basically, thinly suggesting that basically they were supposed to mate in Kirk's cell. Fontana wrote, the interfusion interval, while nicely presented, will probably flip out NBC broadcast standards if they are clever enough to realize what an interfusion interval is supposed to be. Can we avoid the rather obvious couch and Shauna lying down on it? In the story, Kirk, Uhura, and Sulu are pulled off course in a shuttlecraft and forced to land on the uncharted planet of Pentathlon, where they are captured and trained for combat games. During the interfusion interval, Kirk is paired up with Shauna, which the script describes as a tall, beautiful Amazon. Uhura with Belial, a quote, gleaming Nubian, and Sulu with Taki, a quote, squat, furry green female. Squat, green, and furry kind of makes her sound like the salt sucker from the Man Trap. The master thrall is Galt, who reports directly to the rulers, who at this point are referred to as the cogitants and described as, quote, pulsating amoeba like creatures about the size of a large jellyfish in transparent boxes floating in a colored fluid. Armin revised her outline on May 5th. The outcome was very different than the filmed version, as there was no conflict on the Enterprise between Spock, McCoy, and Scotty at this point. The scenes on the ship were by and large uneventful. All three characters were in agreement concerning how to search for the captain and the two missing officers. Halfway through the story, they find the missing shuttlecraft floating in space. There is no explanation why the cogitants sent the shuttle back into space or how it even got there. Now, as usual, this thing goes through a lot of rewrites, and I'm not going to go through every interval, of the script and all the memos they were sending back and forth because most of it's pretty tedious. I'll just kind of hit the highlights here. Now, Roddenberry knew the only way to get Armin's story into script was with NBC's blessing. So he told Gene Kuhn, perhaps this is one of those cases in which the best answer is for our production office to revise the outline, as we did with Jerome Bixby's script. So Roddenberry had been the one to rewrite Jerome Bixby's story outline for Mirror Mirror to make it more to NBC's liking. He felt it was now Gene Kuhn's turn, but Kuhn was overwhelmed with other work and instead chose to send the outline to Stan Robertson at NBC unchanged. Contrary to Robert Justman's prediction, Stan Robertson was not thrilled with it. Robertson felt there were too many similarities between the gamesters of Triskelion and Bread and Circuses, with both stories depicting the Enterprise crew being forced into gladiatorial combat. He agreed to approve the story only on the condition that Kuhn would revise the outline and distance gamesters from circuses. Let me take a drink of water right quick.
Now, like Roddenberry, one area Justman found reminiscent of past episodes was the teaser where Kirk, Sulu, and Uhura travel in the shuttlecraft and are forced to land on a strange world. And this had been done in previous episodes, of course, including Galileo 7 and Metamorphosis. And Roddenberry suggested they needed to find some reason to get them down on the planet that didn't involve the shuttlecraft. It wasn't so much a reason, really, but just finding a way to get them there. The only other means Kuhn could think of was to just have Kirk, Uhura, and Sulu simply vanish from the Enterprise and appear on the planet. This popping in and popping out device had also been used before, though, in The Squire of Gothos and Arena and Catspaw. But then wouldn't using that for a fourth time be more redundant than using the shuttlecraft forced to land on a strange planet bit for a third time? Kuhn decided to just leave the teaser as it was with the shuttlecraft. So Kuhn had Armin do a second draft teleplay, which arrived on June 28th. More changes were needed, and Kuhn delegated the job at this point to Fontana of sending further notes to Armin. So she had read over the latest draft and sent some more corrections to Armin, and she didn't panic. She merely got back to writing. Years later, Fontana said, quote, "Maggie always did a good job. She was a good, solid writer, and she loved this kind of stuff." So there was a revised draft turned in on July 31st, which was sent off to the Mimeo department and designated as the yellow cover draft number 1. Now, Bob Justman wrote a memo to Kuhn on August 3rd, fretting over the costs of filming an episode from the current script and the impossibility of getting it all done in only 6 days. One area where he felt money could be saved was by eliminating the shuttlecraft, something he and Roddenberry continued to lobby against. By mid-September, Gene Kuhn had stepped away from his production chores and handing them off to John Meredith Lucas. With NBC's interim order for 2 episodes, Lucas picked Gamesters and Obsession as the best candidates. Armin's August 16th final draft was sent to the staff for comment. Justman wrote to Lucas on September 1st saying, quote, "For the most part, I think Margaret Armin did a pretty good job on her polish." Pretty good in this case, meaning that he only had 4 pages of corrections. So another draft was done. And then I think Kuhn did a polish on it. So remarkably, after 4 drafts of a story outline, one by Kuhn, and 4 drafts of the script, the story structure and dialogue in the Gamesters of Pentathlon was light years away from what would eventually be on the screen. Besides the Callers of Obedience not yet being a part of the story, many other elements to be seen in the film version were still missing, including Galt's glowing eyes and the ability to pop in and out of scenes, Shauna's green hair, Chekov in place of Sulu, and the conflict on the Enterprise between McCoy and Scott and Spock. Over the at least a quarter of the story structure and more than half of the dialogue in the script would still need to be changed. John Meredith Lucas was the next to work on the script. His first pass, the revised final draft, came on September 28th. This version still opened with Kirk and the 2 crew members in the shuttlecraft. Uhura was one, but now Sulu had been changed to Chekov. This was because George Takei was still stuck on the set of Green Berets. So, and if you've watched previous Trek Talk streams, the last few, George Takei left for a while because he got a role in the John Wayne movie, The Green Berets, and it was filming for a while, but I forget the reasons, but the filming went over schedule, and so he was not able to get back when he thought he was going to get back. And there were, I think, at least 2 or 3 scripts he had significant roles in that were actually rewritten for Chekov because he wasn't there. Takei later said, quote, "There was this one particular script, the Gamesters of Triskelion, and I wanted to do it very much. Roddenberry had showed it to me before I took off for Georgia. Well, we had some rain, and that delayed the shooting of the picture. Yeah, I guess there were storms. And they had to change the schedule. It was frustrating because I wanted to come back and do that show. As it turned out, they rewrote it for Walter. Chekhov got all of Mr. Sulu's lines. I've got to admit, though, that despite my disappointments, I was pleased that Walter was able to do it." All right, now Roddenberry took a look at the rewrite that Lucas did, and he had more changes, of course. All of Roddenberry's suggestions would be implemented as Lucas took charge of the second and third drafts, revised final drafts, both in early October. The shuttlecraft was finally removed, and the much simpler and quicker long distance transporter gimmick was used. The conflict on the Enterprise with McCoy and Scotty challenging Spock was also added, and the title was changed at this point from the Gamesters of Pentathlon to the Gamesters of Triskelion. And let me take another drink of water right quick here. Okay, and I think the reason they changed it from Pentathlon to Triskelion was in one of the earlier drafts, instead of having to fight 3 thralls at the end, Kirk has to fight 5 thralls. 5 pentathlon, pentagon, that sort of thing. Penta meaning 5. And I'm guessing that for cost purposes, they probably cut the 5 down to 3. And therefore, that necessitated changing pentathlon to something else. And so they came up with Triskelion. There was also another cost cutting measure that was originally they didn't have the pain collars. Instead, there were like guards. There were these overseers who were sort of kept the thralls in line. But they cut them out because, again, hiring all those extras was going to be expensive. So they came up with the pain collar gimmick instead. Let's see, where was I? Okay, so with the new title and a shorter script, Gamesters was on its way to production, planned as the first of 2 interim episodes ordered by NBC to be followed by Obsession. The price tag, however, remained a grave concern. Robert Justman wrote, quote, "The script is quite expensive in its present state, and we are going to have to do something about it. There will no doubt be a lot of screaming and crying and agonizing, but we are going to have to do it without sacrificing any of the excitement if possible." So Lucas sat down and created a 4th revised final draft on October 13th, scaling back some of the action called for on the planet where more actors and grander set pieces were required. In its place, more scenes on the bridge with McCoy and Scott continuing to badger Spock over his decision to take the Enterprise in search of the missing crew members. The dialogue in these new scenes is redundant. Yeah, it kind of is. There's several times where they go back to the Enterprise, and basically it's just the same thing. It's McCoy telling Spock he's not doing things right, and Spock basically telling him this is the logical thing to do. Lucas had a tendency to dilute the spoken lines he'd write with too much unneeded chatter and too many repetitive beats, and that tendency is taken to extremes here. But a day of shooting on the bridge was cheaper than a day or more spent on various sets with numerous actors and wild makeup on stage 10. And time had run out to sharpen the material any further. Lucas quickly dashed off 2 sets of page revisions addressing more notes from NBC standards and practices on October 16th and 17th, just one day before filming would commence. Obsession was pulled forward and filmed first, allowing an extra week to try to bring expenses for Gamesters under control. Regardless of the delay, the challenging episode was still a rush job. Now, this was directed by Gene Nelson. This was his first Star Trek episode and his only one. According to Gene Nelson, he was contacted when the director originally hired to handle Gamesters dropped out at the last minute. Production records do not give an indication as to who the original director was. Nelson, a former dancer and director of movies featuring complex dance sequences, was chosen because he could contribute to the choreography of the fight scenes, and he was available on short notice. Nelson, 47 at the time, was began his show business career as a song and dance man, and won the Golden Globe Award as Best Newcomer in 1950 for a musical called Tea for Two. 5 years later, he would play Will Parker, the
the rope trick cowboy in Oklahoma. By the early 1960s, Nelson had turned to directing, handling numerous episodes of The Rifleman, The Farmer's Daughter, and I Dream of Jeannie. He also directed 2 Elvis Presley movies, Kissin' Cousins and Harem Scarum. Quote, the regular cast did all these shows before I came in, so their characters were set, Nelson said. I thought, I can't change them. The only thing I can change is a reaction to something they've never done on the show before. They would react in character, but differently than in any other situation. I had more freedom with the villains. Those villains had to be booked quickly. For the important role of Galt, the master drill thrall, Nelson wanted Joe Ruskin. See if I can get, yeah, there he is. Ruskin was 43. He had often appeared as a bad guy on a number of shows such as The Untouchables, Gunsmoke, Wild Wild West, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Get Smart, Hogan's Heroes, The Twilight Zone. So in the Twilight Zone episode, The Man in the Bottle, he played a genie, actually. Nelson said, quote, Joe's a good actor and an old friend of mine. My inspiration for him was Ming the Merciless from the old Buster Crabbe, Flash Gordon serials. And I was intrigued when I read that because he definitely does have a Ming the Merciless look about him, doesn't he? It definitely fits. You'll notice when you watch the episode that you never see his feet. It's almost like he's floating. He does everything slowly, like when he electroshocks them. He did that just by shutting his eyes. I told him less is more. I don't know if I have a full body shot of him, where you can see the robe all the way to the floor, but yeah, it covers his feet. And he does have this kind of, I don't know what you call it, kind of shuffle walk where he kind of takes these very small steps so that you really can't see his feet coming out from under the robe. Okay. Now, Ruskin remembers that it was his idea to move less and to float rather than to walk. Ruskin said, quote, I had a gown that went from the shoulders all the way to the floor, and I had just seen the Moiseev dancers. They were these Russian folk dancers who were touring in America. And they had a dance in which they had robes all the way to the floor, and they looked like they were just floating around on wheels until the robes were opened and you could see their feet. I found it fascinating. For the part of Shauna, it was felt that a dancer could best handle the demands of the fight scenes. So let's get a good look at Shauna here. Okay, let me try the other one. There we go. Okay, so Angelique Pettyjohn, when cast for the role, was 24 years old. She had worked as an exotic dancer and made her screen debut with a low-budget sexploitation film called The Love Rebellion. 1 year before Star Trek, she had appeared with Elvis Presley in Clambake. At this time in 1967, Pettyjohn had a recurring role on Get Smart as Charlie Watkins, a man disguised as a buxom blonde. Pettyjohn liked Star Trek and was excited to be called in for an audition, but had concerns about the role. She said, quote, I was sitting in the outer office reading the character description, which said, quote, a green-haired, green-eyed Amazon leaps from behind a rock, pinning Kirk with a spear. When I went in for the interview, the first thing I said was, gentlemen, before I waste my time and yours, I really don't feel I fit the description of this character. I've got the green eyes, and I'm sure you can fix me up with green hair, but I'm hardly an Amazon. I'm only 5'6". They laughed and they said, look, honey, next to Shatner, you're going to look like an Amazon. So go ahead and read the script. Damn, roasted. After auditioning, Pettyjohn was asked to pull the hair away from her forehead for a minute. She was reluctant, feeling that she had a high forehead and liked to wear bangs. But she complied, and despite her reservations, the producers liked her striking look, and she was hired on the spot. Britt LaRue, who was the voice of the Guardian of Forever in The City on the Edge of Forever and was the ringside announcer in Bread and Circuses, returned to speak for provider number 1. Let me see. I guess that'll work. Walker Edmiston provided the piercing voice of provider number 2. The kids show host in Los Angeles had been the voice of Baylock back in the Corbomite maneuver and was also the voice of the keeper in the menagerie. Robert Johnson, the voice of provider number 3, spoke for one of the Telosians in The Cage and was the voice on he was the voice of the self-destructing tape at the beginning of every episode of Mission Impossible. So, yeah, that was him saying this message will just self-destruct in 5 seconds. Dick Crockett, the stuntman who guided the other actors through the fight sequences, also appeared as the Andorian Thrall. He was 52 at the time. I don't think I have a good photo of the Andorian. I mean, you can see him down here in the corner, but I don't think I have like a picture of his face or anything. Steve Sandor played Lars. There he is. He was 30 and appeared often on television between 1967 and 1998. Mickey Morton played Klug. The 6'7" actor was 40. He worked often in television whenever a brute or a giant was needed. He also appeared on episodes of Gilligan's Island, The Monkees, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and I Dream of Jeannie. And last but not least, Jane Ross. Let's see. Bring her up here. There she is. Who is delightful in the role of Tam Moon, the instructor thrall smitten by Chekov. She was 35 and a bit player in television. As for the regular supporting players, this was Uhura's third turn as being part of a landing party. Let's see if I can find a good image of them. There we go. And she was given one of the better roles for her in the series. Walter Koenig, also with an excellent role, benefited from George Takei's detainment on the Green Berets. The writing staff was happy to make the change. Koenig told this author, quote, "I was reading in volume 1 of your book that Nichelle had all this fan mail that she wasn't receiving. That happened to me too. I had this enormous volume of mail filled with huge packages of things and sack after sack of letters, and I only got them because I went to where they were being sorted. They were not kept at the studio. They were handled by a service. Thousands and thousands of letters. Most of them were one page and were written on lined paper, so I was able to read them easily. Of course, I only answered 1 in 500. Like one said, quote, 'I am black and I hope this doesn't affect how you read this.' Something that moved me because that person who wrote it brought up some very personal feelings. I didn't answer the ones that just said I was groovy or they thought my hair was groovy." Okay, so filming started on Tuesday, October 17th. Star Trek began filming the Gamesters of Triskelion at 8 a.m. This involves scenes not requiring special setups. Basically, the stuff on the Enterprise bridge and the transporter room. For day 2, the company paid their first visit to the Paramount test stage where the provider's chambers had been built. Gene Nelson remembers, quote, "When we were shooting that, we had designed a room kind of like a tube. I had no way of getting a real wide shot of the room except from overhead. So we climbed up on the ladder into the rigging to get the camera vise. While we were rear lighting, Bill's stand-in was standing near it. That would be Eddie Paskey, I believe. The operator was getting the camera set and had to change the lens. Well, the camera was already set, so when he unscrewed the lens, it slipped out of his fingers and it hit the stand-in on the head, and it knocked him unconscious. We were sweating for a little while, making sure he was okay." Also filmed this day the interior cell corridor scenes where Kirk, Uhura, and Chekov get a taste of the colors of obedience. That would be here. Nelson recalled, quote, "We had a lot of fun with those collars. I said, look, people, as silly as they seem, we've got to take the collars seriously because you never saw where the shock was coming from. We also had to synchronize their reactions to the pain. We decided it should be immediate instead of gradually constricting like in their aborted escape from the jailhouse, where you think they're going to make it until the collars stop them." This was the first day that Angelique Pettyjohn was on set. Gene Nelson said, quote, "Angelique was as sweet as could be. I thought she was quite good in the show, a delight to work with. The first time she came on the set in that costume, the crew nearly fell out of the rafters. She didn't have to wear, she didn't wear a hell of a lot." Pettyjohn said, quote, "I found Shatner to be friendly, gregarious, rather mischievous, with a twinkle-eyed little smile, a really marvelous person around the set. At first, when I came in, I was very much in awe of working with him, but he made me feel instantly very comfortable." And I think I've commented on this before, how when the guest stars are talking, about their experiences on set with Shatner, invariably it's like the men are all basically like, Shatner was a dick. I hated him. And then the women are all, oh, I loved working with Bill. He was so charming and so sweet and so funny. Yeah, I wonder why. Let's see. I thought Leonard Nimoy was marvelous, intelligent, quiet, and a very polite man. I respected him very much. I loved Nichelle Nichols. I thought she was just a doll. Walter Koenig was a really nice guy, very friendly, but rather quiet. He seemed to be a little on the shy side. Day 3, during the second day on the Paramount test stage, the scenes in Kirk's cell, Uhura's cell, and Chekov's cell were filmed. The final sequence involved Chekov and his designated mate Tamoon. Walter Koenig recalled, "The director was a former song and dance man who was just sort of tap dancing his way through this thing. I had this big scene where this homely girl comes into the cell with me and says, 'Let me be your trainer.'" There we go. Or no, excuse me, "Let me be your mate." We had a very funny relationship set up because Chekhov didn't want to have anything to do with her. Because I was the junior member of the cast, my scenes were relegated to the end of the day, which is understandable, but on this particular day, we were pressed for time. So rather than covering me by shooting over her shoulder and covering her by shooting over my shoulder, the director only did it one way. Gene Nelson said they are desperately hard. They try desperately hard to shoot sci-fi shows in the same amount of time they shoot an action adventure. Everybody's on edge because of the pressure. You had to make many sacrifices. I had many exciting things that I planned to do, but you find that you just can't, and you must find another way to get things done. It was Koenig's idea to have him avoid looking at the homely girl, allowing both performers to face the camera. On days 4, 5, and 6, let's see. Angelique Nelson recalled, "Angelique was marvelous because she was very lithe and quick. She had enough dance training so that I could be a little more expansive with her. Bill was very nice, a very good actor, and very energetic. He wasn't at all shy about doing stunts. I remember that Bill talked about staging this fight, and he made it clear to me that he wanted to shoot it without a stuntman. That was fine with me. I prefer it that way too. As I recall, you see only one or two wide angle shots with a difficult stunt like that. Uh, where you're taking a real hard fall, for which I used a stuntman. For the big finale, Kirk is told he cannot step outside the triangles that match the color of his collar. Before the end of the fight, he does, yet nothing is made of it. Yeah, I mentioned that. So, where's that overhead? Yeah. So he wasn't supposed to step outside the yellow, but he does repeatedly. Defending the sloppiness, Gene Nelson said, quote, "You get to the point where you have to build it to an ending. It's just kind of a no holds barred kind of thing. Setting it up that way with the colored sections made it interesting, but after a while, we just said, screw it." Now, it was during this time that an inside source at NBC leaked word that Star Trek would not receive a last minute pickup for the rest of the season. Gamesters would be the last Star Trek episode to film. Bijou Trimble, a frequent visitor to the set, remembered the regular cast would go onto the set and do their stuff and look happy on the screen, but then when the director called cut, they'd all just look sad. And that was so unlike them because generally there'd be a little banter where they'd joke or they'd be smiling. So I was curious and said, "What's going on?" And no one would really tell us until we went over to catering. We were having a cup of coffee and I said, "I wish I knew what was going on." And the craft service person said, "Oh, there's a rumor coming around that Star Trek's going to be canceled." And we thought, "Oh no." And we knew back in those days that anything that didn't have at least 3 seasons was never going to get into reruns or syndication. Angelique Pettyjohn remembered 3 or 4 days after we started filming, John Meredith Lucas came in during lunch and made an announcement to the cast and crew. He was sorry to say the network had canceled the show. Everyone was very depressed. Trimble said, quote, "I can distinctly remember that Nichelle Nichols was so upset that at one point she was just sitting at her makeup mirror in tears. It was quite depressing to watch people work. Actors earn their pay by that day by really acting. They go in front of the cameras and be dramatic or comical and smile as if they meant it, then come off camera with a sigh or a frown." Pettyjohn added, "On my last day of shooting, I had a particular speech where I said, 'Goodbye, Jim Kirk.'" Let me jump to that. There we go. "Goodbye, Jim Kirk. I will watch the lights in the sky and remember." I had tears in my eyes, and those tears were real because I was thinking that I was saying goodbye to Star Trek. I really cried, and that's how I meant it because I knew that the series wasn't going to be shooting anymore. Within 48 hours of the dispiriting rumor, official word came from NBC. The network had reversed its decision and placed an order for 8 more episodes. Shatner said, quote, "Obviously, the hearsay immediately proved to be untrue, but for a 2-day period, we were all convinced that Star Trek was finished." After 2.5 days on set, the cast was released except for Shatner, Pettyjohn, and Ruskin. The final scenes took place among the ruins of the provider's ancient city. Ruskin said, quote, "There was the scene with William Shatner and the girl where I would suddenly pop into view on a rock behind them. So Shatner and the girl would freeze in position and the cameras would stop rolling. As I stepped up onto the rock, the camera started rolling again, and in the final print, it looks like I appear like magic. For those of us who hadn't done these kind of special effects tricks before, it was very exciting." Remarkably, Gamesters of Triskelion finished on schedule in just 6 days. Okay. So this episode aired January 5th, 1968. And in the first half hour from 8:30 to 9 p.m., it was the usual story. Gomer Pyle was by far the winner, getting 42% of the audience share, with Star Trek a distant second at 29.9%, and a show called Operation Entertainment coming up behind them at 25.9%. But in the second half hour from 9 to 9:30, Star Trek actually won that time slot, getting the highest ratings with a 32.2% audience share, which was unusual for them. Operation Entertainment was second at 30.3%, and the CBS Friday Night Movie was third at 27.1%. ABC's Operation Entertainment was a globe-trotting variety series sending performers to entertain servicemen at the nation's far-flung military bases. ABC sprung to buy a half-page ad for the new series and TV guide among TV newspaper sections. NBC made Star Trek win its time slot on its own. The movie that night was a repeat of the popular musical The Music Man. William Shatner named the Gamesters of Triskelion as one of his favorites of the episodes produced by John Meredith Lucas. He regarded it to be exciting, action-packed, and fun to shoot. Nichelle Nichols considered this one of her favorite episodes, not surprising since she has such a large role.
Even with the accolades, Gamesters was Gene Nelson's only assignment on Star Trek. He said, quote, I thought if I do a good job, maybe they'll find a slot on the show for me, but it didn't happen. I would like to have done another couple of Star Trek shows. Uh, it really gave the imagination a whirl because there's no limit. You were able to do things you couldn't do on any other show. As for Angelique Pettyjohn, by the early 80s, the job offers had slimmed down and she turned to softcore prawn, appearing in movies with titles like Titillation, Body Talk, and Stalag 69. She changed her stage name to Angel St. John and then Heaven St. John. But the opportunity to make a living through speaking engagements at numerous Star Trek and sci-fi conventions allowed her to leave these sexploitation films behind. Gene Nelson said, I never met Gene Roddenberry. I think in terms of television, he was one of the geniuses of our time. It was a stroke of genius just getting that show on the air. Joseph Ruskin said, as actors, we do so much junk that occasionally something nice comes along, and that was Star Trek. The Gamesters of Triskelion was a well done episode. And it is a shame that Gene Nelson didn't come back. He did a good job, and apparently he was really excited about the show and like doing it. Whereas there were a number of directors who came on the show and just, hated it and didn't even want to be there. I don't know why they didn't bring him back. I wonder why. Okay, so that's going to do it for Gamesters of Triskelion. So the next episode I'll be doing next week, I believe, what is that? I think it's the immunity syndrome will be the next one. And I will be live streaming probably this Sunday evening, I think. So I'll just go ahead and wrap up there. Thank you to everyone. Oh, please do like the stream. Please do like the stream and sub to the channel if you would. And again, thank you to everyone who tuned in for the stream and everyone who will watch it on a rewatch. And I guess I hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving. And I will see you all next week. Good evening.